Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that considers the economic consequences of the Wall Street crash. Those who had invested heavily in the market were the immediate losers in the crash, but the very rich, although they were the biggest losers, could afford to ride their losses. For example, the Rockefeller family lost 80% of its wealth, but was still left with $40 million. Others, however, lost everything, whilst the biggest losers of all were those who had bought on the margin, because they were left with worthless shares and were in debt. Share prices would continue to fall for another 3 years, but the crisis quickly moved from the stock market back to the wider economy, from where it really began. For the confidence on which the consumer boom had been founded was well and truly shattered. And that was the key. The confidence that the economy would continue to go from strength to strength was no longer there. It was like the emperor with no clothes on. The bluff had been well and truly called. Factories closed, with industrial production falling by 45% between just 1929 and 1932. Production dropped at a rate that could hardly be imagined. Car production fell by 80%. Road construction and the building industry by between 82% and 92%. A third of manufacturing firms in New York had closed by 1932, and a third of the great city's workforce were unemployed. In an inevitable knock-on effect, shops, diners and restaurants, bars and the like, all closed. Between 1929 and 1932, more than 100,000 businesses of different kinds failed. Banks also went bust. By 1933, 11,000 banks out of a total of just 25,000 had been forced to close. The banks had lent money that they wouldn't get back, using the money from the savings accounts that they held. And when those investors that had savings in the banks came to withdraw their money to pay off their own debts, the banks didn't have it. So people lost their savings. As many as 10 million accounts were affected in this way. And in 1933 alone, $140 billion was lost on deposits in banks. It was the worst banking failure in American history up to that point. Unemployment was the most visible result of the Great Depression, for it was on a scale never before seen. Possibly as many as 14 million people were unemployed by 1933. This amounted to just short of 25% of the total workforce. But some cities fared worse than others. In Cleveland, the steel city, for example, 50% of workers were unemployed. And for many of those holding on to jobs, their working hours were cut, or else their hourly wage was cut. For example, by 1933, all of the United States Steel Corporation's workers were working part-time, while average wages fell by 60% between 1928 and 1933. Either way, shorter hours or reduced wages, their families were having to manage on less money. So in this way, the vicious cycle spiraled ever deeper as even more money was taken out of the economy and further reduced the demand for goods. Farm prices fell so low that some farmers couldn't even afford to harvest their crops, and their cattle weren't worth the cost of getting them to market. So that perhaps the ultimate tragedy was that people went hungry whilst food was left to rot, and whilst farmers went bankrupt and were evicted from their farms. And unimaginable as it must have seemed at the time, for many farmers things were about to get even worse. For between 1930 and 1936, the South and Midwest suffered a serious drought. Part of the problem, however, was man-made. Grazing land had been used for crops and over-farmed. Then came the drought, successive years of hot summers, strong winds, and very little rain. Having lost the grass covering it had used for cattle grazing, the topsoil turned to dust, and the winds whipped up the dust into dust storms. This was the Dust Bowl, and more than 3 million farmers and their families were totally ruined as a consequence. Farmers packed what they could onto what they had. The poorest would carry what they could take on their backs, and they left. They lived on the roadside as best they could, often relying on scavenging or charity, though they found little of the latter. They were seen as a burden and a threat to any local community that was relatively prosperous. So there you have the economic consequences of the crash. The crash had led to depression, the Great Depression no less. So if you face a question, like question A, in what ways did the Wall Street crash affect the American economy? Or a question B that asks why the crash led to the Great Depression? Or a question C that asks to what extent was the crash responsible for the Great Depression? I think I've given you some useful material from this presentation to help with your answers. Of course, I'm going to say you'll find a lot more detail in my ebook on Amazon, but that's up to you. And I will do a complimentary video on the social consequences of the crash. So good luck with your studies, and as I always say, thanks for listening. Cheers.